Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Good day to you all. We are very excited to be today with a new session of AI for Good Discovery series on AI for biodiversity. This series represents a partnership between the International Telecommunication Union, the Convention on Biological Diversity, NatureServe, and the Alexander von Humboldt Institute of Colombia. My name is Maria Londoño, and I will be moderating today's session. In the AI for Biodiversity series, we explore a multitude of exciting and creative applications of AI that advance conservation, the monitoring of biodiversity, improve management, enforcement, and surveillance of protected areas, and much more. The 17 SDGs are very much interconnected with biodiversity. We cannot achieve our goals without maintaining and restoring biodiversity. A degraded biosphere has consequences that go far beyond conservation issues and hit at the heart of human health and well-being. So we hope that this series not only inspires you and celebrates the many achievements and innovations by our wonderful speakers, but also serves as a platform to accelerate the sharing and upscaling of creating sustainable solutions and ideas. And of course, we welcome all of you joining online from around the world via AI for Good's neural network platform. Welcome. Today's session is dedicated to the sounds of nature and all the information they provide to us for supporting biodiversity conservation. Global climate change and habitat loss are having an unprecedented effect on biodiversity. Now, more than ever, we need to have efficient methods to monitor these changes so we can implement effective conservation strategies. The recent discipline of ecoacoustics emerged with tremendous opportunities, but also with big challenges in this endeavor. Species recognition and the separation of different resources of sounds, biophony, anthropophony, and geophony, becomes as central for AI to play a role. Using passive acoustic sensors along with AI, we can now identify specific animal species by their vocalization, covering large expanses of territory and extended time frames. This improves not only our understanding of the diversity of life in an ecosystem, but also provide crucial data for conservation efforts and management plans. We will discuss how these tools are being employed in various contexts, from estimating habitat reference of threatened species to assessing the diversity of animal communities in tropical forests, and highlighting the potential benefits for conservation efforts around the world. Finally, we will also examine some of the challenges and limitations of machine listening systems in hyperdiverse ecosystems, as well as opportunity for continued research and collaborations. I'm very excited to introduce our two speakers for today. Juan Daza is a biologist from the Universidad de Antioquia in Colombia, where he is currently an associated professor. He has a PhD in conservation biology from University of Central Florida in the US. Dr. Daza's research is at the interface of evolution, ecology, genetics, and conservation. He is currently leading two different but related research programs. The first one uses genetic data, computational methods, and an integrated evolutionary approach to address hypotheses of systematic speciation and biogeography. The second one is on developing new tools for biodiversity studies, where he has been working in ecoacoustics and artificial intelligence methods to better understand the spatial and temporal dynamics of populations, species, and ecosystems in high diverse neotropical regions. Our other invited speaker is Sebastián Ulloa, who is an electronic engineer from Universidad Javeriana in Colombia, with a PhD in ecology from the Université Paris-Saclay in France. He is currently a researcher at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute in Colombia. Dr. Ulloa's research is driven by the interest of creating smart tools to preserve biodiversity. He has focused on combining acoustic monitoring and AI to assess and predict the impact of global change on tropical ecosystems. As an engineer, he has a strong background in signal processing and pattern recognition, which has equipping him with the skills to adapt these technologies for biodiversity monitoring. Dr. Daza and Dr. Ulloa, the floor is yours.
Sorry, Juan, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so right now it's on? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Maria Jose, for that introduction. So first I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. Okay, so today, Sebastián and I are going to talk about how actually we are using AI and acoustics for understand better the biodiversity in a highly diverse system, which is the tropics. And this talk, it will be divided in two parts. So the first part, I'm going to talk about more as a biologist, more to the biological problems that we are facing in using sounds and AI in biodiversity research. And I will going to show some of the examples that I've been doing for the last 12 years in this topic. And the second part, Sebastián will be talking more about the technical and analytical challenges and also the opportunities in the future to use AI in biodiversity monitoring. So first, I want to start, I'm sorry about this. I'm going to put the laser, okay. So first, I'm going to start saying that this path that I've been doing for the last 12 years is not only from the biological perspective or from the point of view. So I'm really glad that I have been working with many other disciplines from mathematics, computational, biology, engineer, and actually I bring all these colleagues, so all these engineers and computer scientists to the field so we can actually collect data and actually do a better job when we build algorithms and implement methodologies to use AI in biodiversity. So I think that all this audience knows that we are really worried right now about that many natural populations are declining throughout the world. And we know this because we have been using very different methodologies to understand how these populations are declining. And one of those are, we actually measure the population trends and the population presence or species presence in different areas and how disturbance, how climate change is changing all these populations. And now we have data that actually showing that we have to be really concerned and that we need to make decisions to actually reverse this or to improve how those populations are behaving in nature. So for the most part, we actually gather field data from direct observations since like many decades ago. So we go to the field, we count individuals, we detect species by using binoculars or direct observation or traps. But these traditional methods have like many different challenges, or actually they pose kind of big problems. And these methods are limited by, especially in animals, by detectability. So we're not able, by direct observation or traps or anything like those traditional methods, to detect all the species in the world, especially for rare species that we think that they're more vulnerable to habitat disturbance. We're not able, in many cases, to detect those. Also, in tropical countries where the majority of diversity is concentrated, we are limited by resources, which, as a consequence, reflects in the space and time sampling that we could do. So this means that sometimes we gather data from those populations, but for very few sites and also for a short period of time. But we want to actually detect trends at the global level, at the regional level, and across long-term studies. So in the few decades, so we actually are asking now the question, okay, so now, given that rapid habitat and species loss, how can we improve our ways to get really fast and rapid and meaningful information that will lead to informed conservation and management decisions? So we know that we humans, as a sensor for biodiversity, are limited for all these things that I have been mentioning here. But now, with the new technologies, we're using remote sensing from satellites, planes, and even we get really like highly resolution images from the ground, from drones, but also on the ground, we have many different sensors like weather systems or trap cameras. And more recently, we are using recorders to detect, or at least to understand, those natural ecosystems. And we're using those recording devices because we know that sounds, for many, many years, we know that sounds have biological information in species that communicate through the sound. That's why in biology, we study sound to understand topics as behavior, reproduction, sexual selection, so many other topics in biology that are being approached using sounds. And in the most recent years, we actually found that monitoring populations in species throughout sound can be a huge opportunity to increase that space in time in terms of population trends. That's why recently there was a term coined in monitoring using sounds that is called the passive acoustic monitoring. This is, or this involves just like deploying a device in anywhere you wanted to put, program to record as much as you want 24/7. So you can program 1 minute every 10 minutes, or you can record continuously without human intervention, other than just going into deploy the recorder. So that's why we call it passive acoustic monitoring, because there is not like a human intervention while the recording is getting that sound data. But this brings with two challenges. One of the challenge is that, okay, so I'm going to show you some examples, the challenges that we're getting with this passive acoustic monitoring. And I'm going to show some examples that we have been doing in Northern Colombia in an area that is, it has a huge diversity, but also it has different degrees of human intervention. So when we think about biodiversity monitoring as an activity, we think that is a measure in time and space. And the sound that we actually gathering with this passive acoustic monitoring, we want to cover those two different dimensions, the dimension of time and the dimension of the space, because ecological systems are very complex, so we need to better understand the dynamics through expanding time and space in the sampling. So that's why we use recorders and deploy them across the entire landscape, because they can obtain biological data simultaneously in different areas. So in the left is a actual photo that we are showing how we deploying these recorders in this part of northern Colombia. And this kind of array of data gathering actually brings two main challenges. One is a technical challenge in terms of we're using electronic devices, so we have to make sure that these electronic devices are getting the information, are programming well, are functioning well. So it takes a lot of time in before we actually go to the field to make sure that we actually getting what we are intent to do, which is getting sound from many places and across the time. But another challenge, and especially in this region in Colombia, is that we are dealing with a highly diverse ecosystem that has many species that have different sounds. Here I'm just showing some of the species that actually lives in the sites that we are deploying these recorders. So there are like 3 times more than I'm showing here in this picture. But it's just to give, send you a message that we have a high complexity sound system that we need to want to get information or actually knowledge from. So the first thing that we started doing is back in 1914, we designed the first kind of algorithms using AI to automatically identify frog species. Why frogs? Is because we started doing with frogs, because frogs, in terms of other species that generate sounds, they are simpler, so they just a single, like a pulse over tone. So it could be easier to manage in terms of analytical, in terms of analytics. So we use this method that we implemented. There are many other people that are actually trying to use to do the same, like approaching in different ways. We approach it in this way, and actually, it came good because we could get like a very important information about the species. For example, here you can see one of the advantages of using AI and training algorithms to detect a species, but not only to detect the species, but also to actually measure the activity through time. So now we can use these methods to compare different species and how the activity changes through time. If this actually is helpful at this period of time that we were measuring, just imagine that we can monitor in long-term vocal activity, and we can see how like a species can just go down and go up depending on the conservation decisions we made, either on the ecosystem or either on the species. But also we can actually combine these methods to like a more traditional method, or for example with remote sensing methods, and try to understand the relationship between this activity with, for example, in this case, habitat features, like, for example, forest cover, connectivity. So we can actually have a better way to approach how the populations are behaving through time in space and how it's related with all these ecosystems characteristics. And to show like the potential of how AI and algorithms that automatically recognize the species, I always show this example because I love this example. because for me is amazing. It turns out that we have been studying that region for the last 10 years, and in all this period that we were using traditional methods to measure biodiversity, we just only had found one specimens in 10 years. But when we train an algorithms to see, okay, if the species is here, let's train the algorithm with its call. And then we train the algorithm and we could determine that the species was not rare at all. It was actually undetectable. It was undetectable under the traditional methods, but using these algorithms, we could determine that the species is kind of more abundant in the region, and actually that we can monitor these species and other species that are not easy to find. And the other potential for AI methods in the species recognition, I can show you here how effective these methods can be compared to also human analysis. For example, this is a brief study we did in the Amazon, the Colombian Amazon, where we actually have recorded several sites and for this frog, and then we ask the students to actually go and check the audio files, and they checked 300 files just to say if the species was present or not, and they took more than 4 hours to complete the job and get this kind of activity figure for the species. While when we train the same files and we train an algorithms to detect automatically these species, we could use like almost 10 times more files, and actually we could detect not just only the presence but the numbers of calls in each file, and it took us less than an hour to complete that job. Just imagine how actually efficient these algorithms could be to measure not only that we can expand time in space, but also we can improve the efficiency when we actually are analyzing this data. More recently, actually, we moved that algorithm that I just mentioned it there, that it was just mostly designed for frogs. Now we went to explore more into more complex sounds, like, for example, the ones generated by insects and by birds. And then we are showing that our method, proposed method, is getting better and better because we are using different approaches. For example, in this case, we were using an unsupervised learning in different clustering methods to actually detect these different signals from the different files. And this span also not only that we will focus on the specific organisms, but we can focus on the entire communities in a specific region. And last, I wanted to mention that we want to explore beyond species recognition, because AI so far has been using sounds mostly in species recognition, but we want to explore more than that, because natural ecosystems are more than just only species, and they can be at the higher levels, for example, at the landscape. When we use remote sensing to see a landscape, we can get a surface of the landscape, so we can see how the composition and the structure of the different features are in this landscape. And also we use in sounds what is called the soundscape. But the soundscape, what we were getting is not like the remote sensing we're getting, that we get in a surface. When we talk about soundscape, we talk about this specific, like for example, in these circles where the recorder is deployed here, and the recorder can get sound information from this radio. But we get this, so when we actually talking about soundscape, we are talking about this discrete points in that landscape surface. So we started exploring how can we use AI methods to actually identify those discrete parts in a landscape. So we started using acoustic indices, which are very used in something that Maria mentioned, that is ecoacoustics, to have different questions in ecology. So we started using acoustic indices and try to detect the differences in sounds. Now it's not like a species when you talk about, for example, a species, let's say there is a single instrument. Now we're talking about the entire orchestra that is sound in the entire ecosystem. So we're using that sound to separate, for example, mature forest, secondary growth, pasture. In this case, we were tracking, like trying to detect these three categories. And the nice part to work with different disciplines, with computer scientists, engineers, so they came to me, they say, Juan, the algorithms is not working well because we can recognize the streams like mature forest and pasture or open areas, but we cannot have good hits when we're talking about secondary growth. So there is something wrong with the algorithms. And I say, no, that's actually sounds perfect, because for many times we think that the landscape is composed by discrete discrete habitat. For example, when we're talking about habitat disturbance, we talk about low disturbance, medium disturbance, and high disturbance. But we actually know that this actually is a continuous. So the habitat disturbance is a continuous, that there is no categories like what we see when we talk about species. There are discrete units, evolutionary units that can be recognized using the sounds. But in habitat or in landscape, the task is not that easy. However, we actually exploring more and more because this represents a challenge, and we are actually working hard in this topic. So that's why we are trying to use supervised learning to identify different categories of habitat disturbance in dry forest in northern Colombia. Actually, we are going further and see explicitly in the region how can we use these methods to identify those transformed landscape, that we can actually use classifying methods to better understand how the habitat is changing through space and through time. And I wanted to end this part with this that we already, we don't have yet results, but some of my students are actually moving forward to what we call the soundscape connectivity. So we actually want to use these methods and try to understand the soundscape as a surface, not as a single points throughout the space, but also to actually entire surface like the one that remote sensing is doing. So we actually collected a very extensive sound system. So we actually making a grid to kind of a ground truth. So we can test many different methods to actually how can we approach different ways to interpolate or to understand the sound as a real scale. It means like a real landscape of sound. And even we've been moving forward to see actually that soundscape can be understood in not only like natural areas, but also where the different sources of sounds are being produced. Like, for example, in an urban and rural area. So with this, I just wanted to pass the floor to Sebastian, who is going to show more of the methods and the results, and also the technical challenges we are facing. But before I leave, so I just wanted to leave you with these two slides. So always I've been asking these three same questions. So why AI is good for us for biodiversity monitoring using sound? Why is AI necessary? And is AI better than traditional approaches? So definitely there are pros and cons that we have to deal with. So we increase detectability, but we also exclude many species that they don't produce sounds. So we always can find pros and cons in this, but definitely it has a huge potential because we are convinced that biodiversity monitoring needs to use automatic sensors rather than human observation. So I show you how efficient this could be. But this also leads to a vast amount of data to be collected, both in time and space, because biological systems are very complex and unpredictable. We still don't understand like the sound when we actually looking at the entire orchestra. So we know about communications and species and individual to individual, but at the entire ecosystem, we're still far from there. And we know that AI might be the solution, but we are still far from there. And that's actually the point that Sebastian is going to be addressing for the next part of the talk. So Sebastian, the floor is yours. Let me...
Thanks, Juan, for the ecological context and for sharing that amazing research. So I work in another lab than Juan. I work at the Humboldt Institute, where we develop research that contributes to knowledge conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. I would also like to acknowledge that this research is not just mine, it's part of a very large group of research, and that includes the Sampling Research Network. So thanks to all of the members and also the financial institution that made this research possible. When we think about machine learning and passive acoustic monitoring, maybe this is like the idea that we have in mind. To have an audio recorder, it can be a cell phone, it can be also an acoustic recorder that is capable of hearing a piece of sound and name all the species in seconds. And this would be just fantastic, but it's much more challenging. And also there are many more applications that machine learning can bring to passive acoustic monitoring. We have here the possibility of identifying species by sound using classification method, supervised learning, but we can also use pre-trained models, so use transfer learning and then fine-tune to a specific task. When we have few samples or we want to use human-in-the-loop training, you can use active learning, or we can even use regression to estimate population density through acoustics. And we can also use unsupervised learning techniques, as Juan showed us. You can visualize and measure diversity between samples. You can also, with self-supervised learning, can use audio separation techniques, and you can estimate sound type diversity using clustering methods. All these methods are fantastic, they are advancing, but still we have something that lacks, and it's behind all these developments. And this is datasets, because datasets are the building blocks of machine learning. So this is where we've been working. There are structured collection of data for training, evaluating, and testing machine learning models. And we think that many of you are familiar with ImageNet, which is a very large data set comprised by 1.28 million images, 1,000 categories, and it was launched in 2009, and it has had a huge impact in computer vision and engineering. Once you have a data set, you can do a benchmark, and this is just coupling the data set with a machine learning task. And this is fantastic to have a common base to compare the performance of different models. Unfortunately, in passive acoustic monitoring, benchmarks and data set are still scarce. They are more focused on bird vocalization and temperate regions. And when you have data sets, they lack an evaluation metric, experimental protocol, or baseline models. So it becomes difficult to compare the models and techniques to determine the most effective methods. And this is why I would like to provide an overview of the technical challenges, but also the opportunities associated with developing machine learning systems in the context of passive acoustic monitoring. And to do so, I'll focus on the case study of anurans. So anurans are frogs and toads whose vocalization are a prominent component of the soundscape in tropical environments. They are the most endangered vertebrate group, with more than 40% of the species considered at risk of extinction. During the breeding season, males call to attract females, maintain territories, and deter competitors. So calling performance is tightly associated with individual fitness. That is why their status can be sharply tracked using passive acoustic sensors. And this is also why we built a collaborative program for monitoring tropical amphibians that's called SoundClean. It was established in 2019 and aggregates more than 40 researchers from Brazil, Colombia, Bolivia, and French Guiana. We have at the moment 38 monitoring sites, and we have collected more than 45,000 hours of audio. And the problem is not the collection, but the problem is to analyze the terabytes of audio recording that represents a huge bottleneck that prevents us from getting the ecological insights from our data. So this is where machine learning comes in. And we built a machine learning system where we have this data that was collected. We annotate manually some of the samples. This is done by experts. Then we prepare a data set and we train different models to have a benchmark. We iterate multiple times, and once we're happy, we perform some inferences. So let's go through the first step, which is the annotation. From this huge amount of data, what we do is we cannot annotate that all the data, but we can take a subsample of the data, which is representative and shows the diversity and variety of the sounds, using a random file certified sample. So we take night and daily periods, seasonal periods, and depending on the local breeding season of the different species. Once we have that, we go to the manual annotation part, and I want you to have a look at this diversity of sound texture. So for those of you that are not familiar with spectrograms, these are representation of sounds that in the x-axis you have the time, here are 10 seconds. In the y-axis you have the frequency, which it goes from 0 to 10 kilohertz, and the amplitude is given by the intensity of the pixel. And you can also see beyond the diversity also the different levels of calling activity and the co-occurrence of multiple signals. So please hear this. So these are the challenges that we are faced when building machine learning models. Once we have the data annotated, we go to the dataset preparation. Here, we wanted to build a first large dataset for tropical amphibians. We have had as an input the 60-second audio recordings. We framed this as a multi-label problem because, as you could hear, you have the co-occurrence of multiple species at the same time. So we also pre-processed the audio, we trimmed it, we applied a bandpass, and we normalized the audio. We applied for that a sliding width of 1 second, and we had samples of fixed length of 3 seconds. So the final output are these samples of 3 seconds, and that have a 75% overlap. The result is this first large data set focused on tropical amphibians, which covers 2 biomes, 4 sites, 42 species, 26.7 hours and has more than 93,000 samples. These data sets show other challenges that we face here. For example, this long tail distribution that we can have, that it's normal for real world scenario, but it's even more marked in tropical environments. So this is why we have to frame this as different problems where you have frequent species, common species, and rare species. And we divided this between trained and test samples. To have a little context of where we are with this ANURA set, the larger, of course, data set that we have at the moment based on audio are from speech recognition, but you have also audio set, which is a large data set from environmental sounds. And then you have some and more data set from passive acoustic monitoring, but this is the first data set that's focused on tropical amphibians. We published already this data set recently, like 15, some days ago. And also, while publishing this data set, we performed some benchmark experiments. So the goal is to have a species code identification framed as a multi-label classification. The performance metrics was the F1 score because we have unbalanced classes. And we split the data set with iterative stratification in 1 minute file to avoid leakage because we have some temporal autocorrelation. And for a baseline model, we use these preprocessing steps, which you have the audio, then you compute a null spectrogram, then you perform augmentation in time and frequency, and then you use ResNet models pre-trained in ImageNet. So this is the idea. You have ImageNet, which is this very large data set where you train the ResNet architecture to have weights, and then you use transfer learning approaches to adapt it to our problem, which is identify these spectrograms that can be converted to images. What we found is that, of course, deeper models perform better. The ResNet 152 was better than the other two ResNet that had fewer layers. But the rare instances had a very poor classification score, and this is one of the major problems that we face, being able to have a good classifier using few samples. This is more evident here in this slide where we have the performance score as F1 metric for each of the sites and each of the species. And as you can see, we have a direct relationship, a positive relationship between the number of samples and the F1 score. So, but of course, we also see that some of the species perform quite well, so we can do some inferences on those species just to show all the potential that we have behind. We have these 4 sites that represent 1.7 thousand days, 150,000 audio files, and we had 8.7 million detections. And we detected the different species. And these are the results. It's evident that passive acoustic monitoring powered with machine learning provides new lens to ecological questions. Here we have the model's confidence of presence across 1 year of assessment at 15-minute resolution. This is a resolution that it's unprecedented and can help us to identify, for example, relationships between temperature and acoustic activity, which can lead us to understand the vulnerability of the different species to climate change. So machine learning can have a huge impact in passive acoustic monitoring, but passive acoustic monitoring can also be a playground to explore machine learning questions. We have here a fine-grained audio classification problem. So the problem is how to classify the species calls in natural environment with co-occurrence between species and other taxa in noisy data. We can think about developing human-machine collaboration, how to optimize the annotation expert time, for example, active learning. We can also apply some self-supervised learning techniques to use the big amount of data collected without intensive human intervention. We can think this also as a future learning problem, how to improve the performance with small samples classes as rare species, which are very common in tropical environment. But above all, we can also think about this domain shift problem, how to generalize the inferences in new sites and new seasons, because we have recordings that are static in different sites. So I want to show you a little bit how we explore this problem, which is the geospatial distribution shift in passive acoustic monitoring. We have the domain generalization question, how to detect species call in a new site if I have a model trained using previous sites. So we have these 4 sites, we train a model using 3 of the sites, and then we test the model using the other site that is completely new to the model, so it's out of distribution. And while doing so, we realized something very interesting, is that for the biome shift, so when we change biomes, which are different habitats, very different habitats, we see a drop in performance, which is more significant than when we just shift the sites which are in the same biome. And here we can start to understand what are the problems that arise with machine learning, and also the problems that we can make if we use this model blindly to make ecological inferences. So we've seen how we can build a machine learning system, but all the challenges that we see while building these systems. And there are still open challenges. So let's do a summary. You have a high diversity of signals. We have dense choruses with overlapping signals and co-occurrence of multiple species. We have distribution shift problems because we have poor generalization. We have long tail distribution. We have also something very important is the limited interdisciplinary capacity between machine learning and ecologists. So PAM, passive acoustic monitoring, and machine learning together offer a unique opportunity to better understand our natural world and work towards effective and timely conservation. The technology to develop models capable of identifying insects, amphibians, birds, and mammals in terabytes of audio is just around the corner. However, we need to strengthen the collaboration between ecologists, acousticians, and machine learning engineers. Acoustic monitoring not only offers a fantastic way to track biodiversity trends because it's standardized, it has a large taxonomic coverage, it's cost efficient, but also presents a setting for exploring machine learning questions, such as distribution shift, few-shot learning, and long-tail distribution learning. Right now, thousands of sensors are collecting data that urgently need to be scrutinized to get ecological insight of global change. The implementation of creative solutions will open up new possibilities to address more ambitious questions in the framework of ecology and conservation. We invite you to work together to chart this path where data science and conservation can interact to promote knowledge and sustainable use of biological diversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ulloa and Dr. Daza. Very interesting and motivating research. We have some questions from our audience. So this first question goes to, well, yeah, maybe Dr. Ulloa. So you have shown that AI have a huge potential in understanding the integrity of ecosystems. Let's say, for example, classifying habitat disturbance. So Frida Chepkomoy from our audience asks, what are some of the human activities that contributes to habitat disturbance? And maybe you can answer that question also with the challenges of what you are hearing in the nature regarding that question.
I would like Juan Daza to answer that question. I think it's more closely to what you were showing.
If I understand well, the question is like in terms of sound is what you mean, because we know that like the traditional factors that actually are doing habitat disturbance is deforestation, contamination, climate change, but now we're also dealing with sound contamination. Let's say, for example, construction or human activities generates sound that can interfere with animal communications. So sometimes, for example, there are like large infrastructure activities that generates a lot of noise, and this noise can disturb this communication and change the entire, as I mentioned it before, like the orchestra or the natural orchestra that is being like observed in pristine habitats. I hope that answered your question, Frida.
Thank you, Dr. Daza. So we have another question here. Hanek Lankveld asks about old data. So the question is, if I'm correct, you use near real-time acoustic data, but he can also, or she can also imagine that there is a lot of old data, acoustic data files. Do you think this old data will be useful for getting a better understanding of ecosystems and biodiversity conservation? And will your algorithm be applicable for that type of data?
So I think I can answer that question. I think it's a very interesting idea. Of course, all the audio data that we have, in fact, we do have at the Humboldt Institute an audio library that have 25,000 samples of different species that began to be collected in 1990s. So we do have some of this audio that, of course, the idea is to be able to train models that are capable of analyzing different species independent of this context. And that the problem is to train these models that are robust to all these different conditions. But of course, and some of the recordings are focused to some specific species, but here, at least in tropical environments, but I think in other kind of environments, you always have a background sound that also can indicate us a lot about the habitat where the recording was made. So I think that's a very interesting idea that we can apply to understand these trends. So before we start this very intensive way of collecting data. Still, we don't have these data sets so intensively sampled as we do have now. So this is why this way of analyzing ecosystem has been launched, because we have these audio recorders that can be programmed so they can be left on the field independently. And before, I think in the year 2000, we were not using this kind of sensors. I'm not sure if Juan Daza wants to complement something.
No, I think that you say all, but maybe I just wanted to say, like, yeah, that's the main thing in passive acoustic monitoring, that time is one of the main points that you want to describe the biodiversity. For example, because sound has biological information, you can actually inspect all files, like, I mean, from a biological point of view, if a species was present, let's say 100 years ago or 50 years ago, where those files were recorded. And even we can, in theory, determine if the sound has been changing through time. For example, let's say that we can record or we have sounds from birds before urbanization, and see how, like, after 50 years, how that sound or how those birds are communicating after there are more sources of sound in the system. For example, anthropogenic sounds.
Thank you for your answer. We have another question here from Muhammad Nassin. Can such acoustic-based approach can be used to determine the health of the forest? I think you did mention some comments about, let's say, integrity, and with the ecoacoustics, how can we understand better that health? But the question is complemented by this part that I'm a little bit curious about. As plants also emit sounds in stress or under infection. I didn't know that, if that's true.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Can I start that answer, Sebastian? Yes, it was just like recently they found that plants can generate sound under different stress conditions. However, one thing that we didn't mention in here is one of the limitations that acoustic monitoring has. It has to do with the sound and the device. For example, if I have a recorder that doesn't record, let's say, ultrasound, so you cannot monitor species that communicate through ultrasound. And also, if the individual that is generating the sound is too far from the recorder, so the recorder cannot get that information. So that being said, so what happens in what we know now about the plants has been under lab conditions, and they generate sounds with very like low frequency and a low intensity. So we would need very, very specific recorders to do that. So far, the recorders that we use for this monitoring are not that at that resolution level that we can measure plant sounds. Maybe in the future, we will have more technical advances that we can detect very, very low signal that is emitted by plants. I think so.
I want to say something else, because what we've found is that there are more and more application of using acoustics to monitor biodiversity, and this has been amazing. One of the ways that we showed is to use these sensors that capture more the sound environment. And there you have information about the acoustic community that is singing there, so it gives you like this proxy of forest health. But of course, you can do other kind of analysis, but it depends, as Juan has said, on how you record that sound. For example, we've been working on identifying species of pollinators. And to do so, you cannot use just a general microphone omnidirectional to capture that sound. You have to use a special camera where the pollinator can go through and have a better sound information of that species. And the same thing, you can apply it, but it will be with different recorders to understand what is the stress this plant is having. For example, there has been also an interesting research trying to understand if different plants have been infected with some larva that kills the plant. So they make noise when they eat the inside of the plant, and you can detect that and take it out. So there are many, many applications that are there awaiting to be developed a little bit more, so we can use all these techniques to better understand the ecosystem health.
Well, I think that you have actually like partially answered two more questions, but anyway, I will do them. So one is from Frida, and The question is, for how long does this takes to accomplish like the whole process? And what are the possible research topics in the field? You have already given some ideas about that. And I will complement that question with the one asked from Alexandro Berti. What is the real hurdle to have a bioacoustic monitoring that includes insects and mammals? And how accurate will be to derive the whole food chain of these species? So these are maybe questions that are addressing more like the time that it takes to set up all this monitoring and the hurdles to put them on like a real time and fast enough for decision making.
You can start, Juan, but you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, so I will start with, so you talk about how much the whole process takes in terms, I think, if I understand correctly, in terms of computational burden. And in terms of if we can add mammals, insects to all these process, I would say we are facing the same problems that like traditional ecology or monitoring has been solving through time. For example, let's say, okay, for example, here in Colombia, the first monitoring strategies, at least in terms of for, let's say, environmental impacts, they started using birds because birds is easy to go, at least for many of them that you can observe directly. But in time is being added other groups because now we know how better to sample them, but also how they can tell us about the ecosystems. So now we have added amphibians, we have added ants, we have added orchids. So in principle, like we can add everything that generates sounds. Like for example, the plants, I would have to also say that, let's say for the plant sound is like we have to change from the Hubble telescope to the James Webb telescope. So that's the thing that we need to do to start measuring plants. But in theory, we can add as many species that actually generate sounds. But if we know what specific information is that sound given us to better understand the ecosystems and to inform the conservation and management strategies. And the other maybe is about technical, computational. Sebastian?
The other one was about the food chain and identifying insects and mammals. So what first comes to my mind is, for example, bats, because it's true that I want to clarify that with acoustics, we do sample very, very well the insects, the amphibians, the birds, and mammals that vocalize, and particularly the bats that are in these very high frequencies. So this is where Juan was saying. So to monitor bats, we already need some other devices that allows us to go to this ultra sound spectrum. And some of the bats do eat insects that produce sounds, but not all insects produce sounds. So it would be hard to derive the whole food chain. But there can be, if we already know if a specific bat or group of bats feed on a specific group of insects that produce sound, we could understand quite well how the activities are doing. So this is an example, but it's also important to mention that even if we can monitor insects, it's just a particular group of insects. Insects are very, very large. So, and what we monitor most of all are cicadas and orthopterans, that are crickets and katydids.
Thank you. So I think this is a question for Dr. Ulloa. So David Lucas asked, we are working on using PAM for intrusive species detection. The benefit is that the species detection is limited to just a few. However, we do need to be able to respond in near real time, so the integration of machine learning must be localized as well as rapid communication of detection. Has this area been explored in your research?
Yes, it's a very good question. And at the moment, we are working, at least from the Humboldt Institute, more in offline detections and building like robust classifiers to try to identify as much as species we can. But I think it's completely doable to have a very simple classifier inside an audio recorder using, for example, a Raspberry Pi, where you can detect the presence of a single or few species that you want to detect. And instead of sending the sound, you just send the alert of that species. And I think that's what you want to do. And this has been done, I know, for example, detecting illegal deforestation, for example. These are other kinds of sounds. So while we can monitor biodiversity, so different animals, we can also monitor the pressures of biodiversity, which are, as I said, noise pollution and, for example, illegal deforestation or illegal hunting.
Cohen Busik asked something about if you are using disturbance sounds to relate with the species diversity. You just mentioned some of them, but could you maybe expand a little bit on this question?
Sebastian, or me?
Whoever.
Well, whatever, whoever. Okay, so I wanted to mention one thing there. That's one of the challenges that we have in passive acoustic monitoring is to not also separate the species, like identify the different species in the ecosystem that you can, as Sebastian mentioned, yes. So you train and you annotate the files, so you can train the algorithms. But we also have a challenge to kind of separate the different sources of sound. Like, for example, what is generated by humans, what is generated by the species, what is called biophony, and let's say geophony, like rain or waterfall or many other things that actually generated by like natural. So in theory, yes, if you can train an algorithms that can detect, for example, as Sebastian mentioned, like a chainsaw, and then you can relate that frequency of that sound. I mean, frequency is how periodic is that sound with a biological feature, let's say the presence of a species or the communications. But there are many examples that, let's say, for example, how frogs can change the vocal activity in near to like a roadway. So in a highway, when like cars are passing through, so the frogs are changing the way that actually are communicated. So they wait the moment where the big truck is passing through, and then they stop calling, and then after that they start calling again. So if you can recognize that anthropogenic sound, so that noise pollution, you can relate it like in any other like ecological question. You can relate a stressor to a biological property.
Okay, I'm going to have two more questions, or one question and one comment. So the first question is from Claire Gervet. Are there studies in South Pacific Ocean islands that you are aware of?
I don't know. Yes, that's outside maybe what we're doing right now. We are The two of us are more working on terrestrial environments, but there's a huge research that has been doing for on underwater ecosystems that is very, very interesting. So yes, we're not that familiar with that other. In fact, we also need a better collaboration with them because they have some amazing developments that we could incorporate.
And this brings to challenge, more challenges, because, for example, in coastal areas or in island areas, now you add different sounds, like, for example, the waves, the wind, and it brings also opportunities to understand the species, but also challenges to separate the different sound sources.
Yes, and what has been intensively researched is also the impact of noise pollution, as we have been mentioning, on marine mammals. So to understand how this affects them and to also drive some policies that can help them, for example, in their reproductive cycles, or avoid certain routes in certain times. So to avoid this unnecessary stress on them, as you said, because I think we didn't discuss some noise pollution, but it does affect us. It has already stated multiple times on the World Health Organization, and this, of course, affects all the biodiversity.
Great, and well, finally, I think many of our audience are willing to hear more of the chorus sounds that you show, Sebastian. They are really great. Could you tell us a little bit more? Where can they find those sounds?
Yes, I just put a link on the sound collection that we have. So there you can explore the sounds and you can ask for the sounds. They are totally open for all the community. So we invite you to explore the library. And there's also a very interesting open library that is Senocanto, or the Macaulay Library, where you can hear thousands and thousands of audio files that were collected on the field with different species.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Daza, Dr. Ulloa, for this amazing presentation. Lots of research that will go on the future for sure. And well, we need a lot of collaboration to continue working on this topic. So hopefully through the neural network, you can start some contribution, collaboration, search for some collaborations there. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. And we invite you to the next session of AI for Biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria C. And thank you, AI,
thank you, Maria,
to invite us, and to everybody that attended the talk. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
AI is a powerful tool.
This summit can help ensure that artificial intelligence charts a course that benefits humanity and bolsters our shared values.
you.